It was one of those perfect spring afternoons when everything seemed normal in the quiet suburbs of Pine Valley. The cherry blossoms were in full bloom, their pink petals dancing in the gentle breeze as Mrs. Thompson drove her well-maintained Honda Civic down Maple Street. As a respected community leader who had spent 20 years running the local youth mentorship program, she was heading to a board meeting at the community center. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the clouds when she noticed the police cruiser trailing her car. At first, she didn't think much of it. She always followed traffic rules to the letter, making sure her registration was up to date and her car was in perfect condition. But something felt different this time. The cruiser's presence grew more menacing with each passing moment, and then came the flash of red and blue lights. Officer Mitchell had been with the Pine Valley Police Department for 8 years, and his record spoke volumes, though not the kind that earned praise. Hidden beneath official commendations were dozens of civilian complaints, all carefully filed away and forgotten in the department's records room. Most came from minority residents who'd encountered him during routine stops, but nothing ever seemed to stick. Mrs. Thompson pulled over smoothly, positioning her car perfectly by the curb. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, just as she taught her teenage son to do. Through her rearview mirror, she watched the officer approach, his hand resting casually on his holster, a detail that made her heart skip a beat. License and registration. He barked before she could even roll down her window completely. The tone in his voice carried an edge that seemed out of place for a simple traffic stop. Mrs. Thompson kept her voice steady and polite as she reached for her documents, movements slow and deliberate. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" she inquired calmly, maintaining the composure she was known for in her community work. Her question seemed to trigger something in Officer Mitchell. His face hardened, jaw clenching visibly as he scrutinized her papers with unnecessary intensity. "You were swerving," he claimed, though Mrs. Thompson knew she'd driven as straight as an arrow. "Step out of the vehicle." The command came sharp and sudden, making several passersby slow down to watch the scene unfold. Mrs. Thompson felt her throat tighten. 20 years of community service, countless hours volunteering at the local school, and here she was, being treated like a criminal. She could see neighbors beginning to gather on their porches, watching silently as the situation escalated. "I wasn't swerving, officer," she stated firmly but respectfully, her years of handling difficult situations coming into play. "I'd be happy to review your dashcam footage." I said, "Step out of the vehicle." Officer Mitchell's voice rose sharply, his hand now gripping his holster more firmly. He reached for his radio, calling for backup on what had started as a routine traffic stop. From her car window, Mrs. Thompson could see Mrs. Chen from the grocery store recording with her phone, while Mr. Rodriguez from the auto shop had stopped sweeping his storefront to watch. The community was bearing witness, but that didn't seem to deter Officer Mitchell. As she carefully unbuckled her seatbelt, Mrs. Thompson thought of her son at home, probably working on his computer projects as usual. She had always taught him to stand up for what's right while staying safe. Now, she found herself in a situation where those two principles seemed to be at odds with each other. Little did she know that this routine traffic stop was about to spiral into something much bigger, something that would shake their peaceful community to its core and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, power, and the courage it takes to stand up for what's right. Things took a dark turn as Officer Mitchell's backup arrived, 2 more patrol cars with flashing lights that lit up the quiet street like a carnival gone wrong. By now, the small crowd of onlookers had grown, with people whispering and sharing concerned looks. The whole scene felt surreal, like something out of a movie nobody wanted to watch. Mrs. Thompson stood beside her car, her heart pounding, but her exterior remaining calm. She'd spent years teaching kids in her community how to handle tough situations with dignity. Now those lessons were being put to the ultimate test. The evening air had grown chilly, or maybe it was just the fear creeping in. "Search the vehicle." Officer Mitchell commanded his colleagues, his voice carrying a tone that made the neighbors flinch. One officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He'd seen Mrs. Thompson at community events, knew her reputation for bringing people together, making Pine Valley a better place. "Sir," Mrs. Thompson spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I have a meeting to attend at the community center. They're expecting me. You can call to verify." "Quiet," Officer Mitchell snapped, cutting her off. His face had turned red, veins visible on his neck. "You people always think you can talk your way out of everything." The racial undertone in his voice was clear as day, making several bystanders gasp. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store was still recording, her hands shaking but determined. Next to her, Mr. Rodriguez had pulled out his phone too. They knew something wasn't right, that this wasn't how things were supposed to be in their community. The search of the car turned up exactly what everyone expected. Nothing. Just some papers for the youth program, a box of granola bars she kept for the kids, and her laptop bag. But Officer Mitchell wasn't satisfied. He seemed to get more agitated with each passing moment, like a pot about to boil over. "The body camera's not working," one of the other officers mentioned quietly, almost apologetically. Officer Mitchell's lip curled into what might have been a smile, but there was nothing friendly about it. "We're taking you in," he announced, reaching for his handcuffs. Resisting a police officer, suspicious behavior. The crowd grew restless. Mrs. Peterson, the retired school teacher, stepped forward. "This isn't right," she called out, but quickly stepped back when Officer Mitchell shot her a threatening look. Mrs. Thompson thought about her son again, probably wondering why she wasn't answering his texts. She'd always taught him that the truth would come out, that justice would prevail. But standing there, watching Officer Mitchell approach with those handcuffs, she wondered if she'd been naive all these years. The other officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. They knew Mrs. Thompson's reputation, knew she ran programs that helped keep kids off the streets, knew she worked with the police department on community initiatives. But rank and loyalty kept them quiet, their silence a heavy weight in the growing darkness. As she was led to the patrol car, Mrs. Thompson held her head high. She could hear phones buzzing all around her as news spread through the neighborhood group chats. The community was watching, recording, bearing witness. But nobody could have predicted what would happen next at the precinct. Something that would test not just Mrs. Thompson's dignity, but the very fabric of their community. In the growing darkness, as the patrol cars pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a stunned crowd of neighbors, the real story was just beginning. And somewhere in a quiet house not far away, a computer screen lit up with incoming messages about what had just happened to one of Pine Valley's most respected citizens. The police station was eerily quiet when they arrived, with only the hum of fluorescent lights and occasional radio chatter breaking the silence. Mrs. Thompson sat alone in a cold holding cell, her dignity wrapped around her like invisible armor. The metal bench was uncomfortable, but she sat straight, just as she'd done during countless community meetings and youth program sessions. Through the cell's window, she could see officers walking past, some avoiding eye contact, others throwing concerned glances her way. A few of them knew her from the Thanksgiving food drives she organized every year, where she'd made sure their families got extra portions too. Now they hurried past, their footsteps echoing in the hollow corridor. Officer Mitchell stormed in, different from before, if that was even possible. There was something wild in his eyes now, something that made the other officers step back. In his hand, he held electric clippers that buzzed with an ominous sound that filled the small cell. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice thick with authority gone wrong. "Your hair could be hiding something." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Thompson had worn her beautiful hair the same way for 20 years, a crown that represented her heritage and identity. "This is unnecessary," said a young female officer from the doorway, her voice barely above a whisper. But she didn't step in. Nobody did. They all just watched, frozen in place by years of looking the other way, of maintaining the thin blue line. Mrs. Thompson's hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. "You have no right," she said, each word clear and determined. "I want to speak to the police chief." The mention of the chief made Officer Mitchell's face twist into something ugly. "The chief isn't here," he snapped, stepping closer. "And I have every right. Security protocol." He spat the words like they left a bad taste in his mouth. The clippers kept buzzing, the sound growing louder in the small space. Outside the cell, more officers had gathered. Some looked away, shame clear on their faces. Others recorded secretly with their phones, knowing this was wrong, but too scared to speak up. The young female officer had tears in her eyes. Mrs. Thompson thought about all the young girls she mentored, how she taught them to stand up for themselves while staying safe. She thought about her son, who'd inherited her strength and sense of justice. What would he think when he saw her? Because she knew, somehow, that this wouldn't stay hidden. "Let the record show," she said clearly, her voice carrying to everyone in earshot, "that I am complying under protest." Her words seemed to echo off the walls, embedding themselves in the conscience of every officer present. The first touch of the clippers felt like ice against her scalp. Strands of her beautiful hair began falling to the floor, each lock representing years of pride and identity. Officer Mitchell's hands weren't gentle. They weren't meant to be. But with each pass of the clippers, Mrs. Thompson sat straighter, held her head higher. One of the older officers finally turned away, muttering, "This ain't right," under his breath as he walked out. Others followed, unable to watch but unwilling to stop it. The young female officer stayed, tears now flowing freely down her face, her phone recording everything from an angle that caught both Officer Mitchell's cruelty and Mrs. Thompson's dignity. As the last of her hair fell to the cold floor, Mrs. Thompson kept her eyes forward, focused on the wall ahead. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Instead, she silently recited the words she often told her youth group. "Your dignity isn't in how others treat you, but in how you carry yourself through the storm." Little did Officer Mitchell know that his act of cruelty was being captured not just by the young officer's phone, but by multiple sources. And somewhere in Pine Valley, a computer genius was about to turn this dark moment into a catalyst for change that nobody saw coming. Back at home, Mrs. Thompson's son sat at his computer, worry growing with each passing minute. His mother was never late, and she always answered her texts. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The community center had called asking where she was, and that's when the first wave of real fear hit him. His fingers flew across the keyboard, checking the family tracking app they'd installed last year. His mother had insisted on it after a friend's car broke down on a dark road. The blue dot on the screen made his heart stop. The police station. Messages started flooding his phone from neighbors who'd witnessed the traffic stop. He opened his group chat with the tech club friends he'd made at the robotics competition last summer. They were more than just computer geeks. They were his support system, his backup plan. "Emergency," he typed. "Need your help. Mom's in trouble." The response was immediate. His friends knew his mother. She'd baked cookies for their meetings, helped fund their projects, believed in their dreams when other adults just saw kids playing with computers. Within minutes, screens lit up across town as his tech-savvy friends gathered virtually, ready to help. "Police station security cameras," one friend messaged. "Already on it," another replied. They'd spent countless hours practicing cybersecurity, learning how systems worked. Now those skills had a purpose beyond winning competitions. The son's room became command central, multiple screens glowing in the darkness. His hands shook slightly as he worked, but his mind stayed focused. His mother had always taught him to use his skills for good, to stand up for what's right. This was his chance to prove he'd learned those lessons well. As he navigated through digital pathways, his phone kept buzzing with messages from concerned neighbors. Mrs. Chen had sent the video of the traffic stop. Mr. Rodriguez shared footage of the arrest. but it was the live feed from the police station cameras that made his blood run cold. He watched in horror as Officer Mitchell approached his mother with the clippers. The son's fingers froze above the keyboard for a moment, tears blurring his vision. But then he remembered what his mother always said. When something's wrong, don't just watch. Act. With newfound determination, he began accessing every camera in the precinct. Body cameras that officers thought were off were actually streaming to secure servers. Security cameras captured every angle. The young female officer's phone provided the closest view of what was happening. His tech club friends worked together like a well-oiled machine. One handled the video feeds, another secured their digital tracks, a third prepared the live stream platform. They weren't breaking things, they were revealing truth. His mother had always said that sunshine was the best disinfectant. The son's hands moved with purpose now, combining video feeds, adding timestamps, making sure every detail was clear. He thought about all the times his mother had stood up for others in the community, how she taught him that power doesn't make right. Outside his window, car lights passed as neighbors began gathering, drawn by the buzz of social media and text messages. The community was waking up, coming together. The son could hear voices in the street, phones ringing in nearby houses. As he prepared to broadcast everything to the world, he remembered his mother's words about responsibility and consequences. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. With one final click, he would show the world what was happening behind those police station walls. The live stream button glowed red on his screen, waiting. In that moment, he wasn't just a teenager with computer skills. He was his mother's son, standing up for what's right. And he was about to turn Pine Valley's quiet evening into a moment that would change everything. The live stream started with a simple message. Watch what's happening at Pine Valley Police Station right now. Within seconds, hundreds of local viewers tuned in. Within minutes, those hundreds became thousands. The son had created a split-screen view, one side showing Officer Mitchell's cruel act, the other showing his mother's unwavering dignity. Local news stations picked up the feed first, then national networks. Comments and shares exploded across social media platforms. The son watched as his mother's story spread like wildfire, each share a spark of justice catching flame. His tech friends kept the stream stable, making sure nothing could shut it down. "This is bigger than we thought," messaged one of his tech club friends. The viewing numbers were climbing into the tens of thousands. People weren't just watching. They were reacting, sharing, calling for action. Every cruel moment was being witnessed by the world. In his room, surrounded by glowing screens, the son felt a mix of pride and pain. Pride in his mother's strength as she sat there, head high despite everything. Pain watching her endure this injustice. But he knew this was what needed to happen. Sunlight on darkness, truth breaking through walls of silence. The young female officer's phone footage provided the clearest view. Her hands had trembled while recording, but the image was steady enough to show every detail. Other officers' body cameras, secretly still running, captured different angles. Together, they told a story that couldn't be denied or explained away. Comments flooded the livestream chat. "She runs our youth center." "This is the woman who helped my kids get into college." "She organized our food bank during the pandemic." The community's voice grew stronger with each message. Local civil rights lawyers started calling news stations. Police accountability groups shared the feed. Even retired police officers began speaking out, condemning what they were seeing. The son's tech friends tracked the spread. The story had reached major cities across the country. Outside the house, neighbors gathered on the street. Some held phones up, showing others the live stream. Others made calls to city officials, demanding action. Mr. Rodriguez brought his family. Mrs. Chen closed her store early to join the crowd. The community wasn't just watching. They were standing up. The son kept his focus on the screens, making sure every moment was captured, saved, backed up. His mother had taught him that technology was a tool. It could help or harm depending on how you used it. Today, it was a tool for justice. Inside the police station, officers began noticing their phones buzzing nonstop. Family members were calling, asking questions. The young female officer, still recording, saw her supervisor watching the live stream on his phone, face growing pale with each passing second. The son added a ticker to the bottom of the live stream, showing the time elapsed since his mother's arrest. No warrant. No charges. No rights raid. Just pure abuse of power, playing out for the world to see. The viewer count kept climbing. Some of his tech club friends had started tracking Officer Mitchell's history. Complaints filed, cases dismissed, patterns emerging. Others monitored social media reactions, capturing the public's response. Everything was being documented, organized, preserved. The pressure was building. Police department phones rang constantly. News vans started arriving outside the station. The mayor's office released a statement saying they were looking into the situation. But the Sun knew looking wasn't enough. The world was watching now, demanding action. As part 5 of this unfolding story reached its peak, the Sun noticed movement on the security cameras. Someone important was entering the police station, moving quickly through the halls. Change was coming, walking on 2 legs, heading straight for the holding cell where his mother sat, still proud, still unbroken. The crowd outside the police station grew larger with each passing minute. The evening air was thick with tension as people from all walks of life gathered: teachers, shop owners, students, and parents. They weren't just faces in a crowd, they were people whose lives Mrs. Thompson had touched over the years. "She helped my daughter get a scholarship," one woman told a news reporter who had rushed to the scene. "When we couldn't afford school supplies, she found a way." More stories emerged from the crowd, each one painting a picture of a community leader who had given everything to help others. The local news van's bright lights illuminated faces in the growing darkness. More media trucks pulled up, their satellite dishes reaching into the night sky like metal trees. Reporters moved through the crowd, collecting stories, capturing the community's pain and anger. Inside their homes, people who had never attended a protest in their lives put on their coats and headed out. The retired high school principal arrived with his wife. The owner of the local diner closed early, bringing coffee and sandwiches for the crowd. Even the minister from the downtown church stood among them, his presence lending gravity to the moment. Social media exploded with support. People shared old photos of Mrs. Thompson at community events, organizing food drives, mentoring students, leading workshops. Each image was a reminder of what she meant to Pine Valley. The hashtag Justice for Pine Valley started trending nationally. The Sun's livestream had now reached millions. News networks picked up the story, running it as breaking news. Civil rights leaders from neighboring cities were already on their way. Phone calls flooded the mayor's office, the police department, and local government officials. "Remember when she stayed up all night with the flood victims?" Someone in the crowd called out. "Set up a shelter in the community center." Others nodded, remembering how she coordinated relief efforts, making sure everyone had dry clothes and warm food. The young female officer who had recorded the incident found her voice. She stepped outside, still in uniform, and faced the crowd. "I've submitted my official statement," she announced, her voice shaking but determined. "What happened in there was wrong, and I won't stay silent." Cars honked in support as they drove past. People from neighboring towns began arriving, drawn by the news and social media coverage. They brought signs, water bottles, and a determination to stand with the community. Local business owners joined the protest. The hardware store owner, the florist, the pharmacist. People who had known Mrs. Thompson for years, who had seen her work tirelessly to make Pine Valley a better place. They shared stories of how she had helped their businesses survive tough times, how she had brought the community together. Through it all, the live stream continued. The Sun watched as comments poured in from across the country. People offered legal help, support, and resources. Civil rights organizations released statements. Politicians began asking questions. The small town incident was becoming a national conversation about justice and accountability. Inside the station, officers shifted uncomfortably as they watched the crowd grow. Some recognized faces in the crowd, people they served with, lived next to, saw every day. The weight of the community's judgment pressed against the station walls like a physical force. As night fell completely, someone brought candles. The crowd lit them one by one, until the space in front of the police station glowed with hundreds of tiny flames. It was a peaceful show of solidarity, a light in the darkness, a message that couldn't be ignored. The community's response had transformed from shock to action, from whispers to shouts, from individual concern to collective demand for justice. And through the station's windows, those responsible for this injustice could see that their actions wouldn't be buried in paperwork or forgotten in files. Change was coming, carried on the shoulders of a united community. The police chief's arrival changed everything. Her car pulled up to the station with lights flashing, but no siren, parting the sea of protesters like a knife through butter. She was a tall woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much to be fooled by excuses. The crowd fell silent as she stepped out, her face set in stone, as she watched the live stream on a phone someone handed her. She didn't waste time with speeches. The chief marched straight into the station, her footsteps echoing through suddenly quiet halls. Officers who had been standing around snapped to attention, their faces a mix of relief and worry. They knew that look in her eyes. It was the same one she'd had when she cleaned up the drug task force last year. Inside the holding cell, Mrs. Thompson still sat with perfect posture, despite everything. The floor around her was scattered with her hair, each strand a testament to abuse of power. Officer Mitchell stood nearby, his earlier confidence evaporating as the chief appeared in the doorway. "What the hell is going on here?" The chief's voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of incoming consequences. She took in the scene, the clippers, the scattered hair, the trembling young female officer still recording in the corner. Officer Mitchell started to speak, but the chief held up her hand. She'd already seen the footage, watched it spread across social media like wildfire. "Give me your badge and gun," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "You're suspended, effective immediately." The chief then turned to Mrs. Thompson, her stern expression softening with genuine concern. "Ma'am, I can't begin to apologize enough." She knelt down, eye level with Mrs. Thompson, speaking not as a police chief, but as one human being to another. "Let's get you out of here and get you any medical attention you need." Other officers sprang into action, some bringing water, others gathering Mrs. Thompson's belongings. The young female officer, who had recorded everything, stepped forward, offering her own jacket to Mrs. Thompson. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about choosing the right side of history. Outside, the crowd held its breath as the station doors opened. When they saw Mrs. Thompson walking out with the chief, heads held high side by side, the silence broke into cheers and calls for justice. The son's live stream caught the moment perfectly. His mother, dignified even in her pain, and the chief, already pulling out her phone to call the district attorney. News cameras swarmed, but the chief created a protective barrier around Mrs. Thompson. "My officers are here to protect and serve," she announced to the reporters, her voice carrying across the crowd. "What happened today was a betrayal of that duty, and it will be dealt with accordingly." The crowd parted again, this time making way for Mrs. Thompson's son, running from where he'd been coordinating the live stream. The reunion between mother and son was caught on every camera, but nobody who saw it could call it a media spectacle. It was pure love, pure relief, pure strength passing between two people who had fought injustice their own ways. The chief didn't stop at suspending Officer Mitchell. She ordered an immediate review of all his past cases, all his interactions, all the complaints that had been filed away. She announced it right there, standing on the steps of the station, making sure everyone knew this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. As mother and son got into the chief's personal car for a ride home, The crowd's energy transformed from protest to celebration of justice in action. The chief had shown what real leadership looks like, not defending wrong actions because of a badge, but standing up for what's right, no matter who does wrong. That evening marked a turning point for Pine Valley. It wasn't just about one incident or one officer. It was about a community standing up, a son fighting for his mother, and a police chief showing that protecting and serving means holding your own accountable. The days following the incident moved at lightning speed. Officer Mitchell's suspension made national headlines, but that was just the beginning. The police chief kept her word, launching a thorough investigation that turned over every stone in the department's garden, revealing weeds that had been growing for years. The district attorney's office moved quickly, treating the case with the seriousness it deserved. They didn't just look at what happened in the holding cell. They dug deeper, examining years of traffic stops, arrests, and civilian complaints. The numbers told a story that couldn't be ignored. "We found a pattern," the DA announced at a packed town hall meeting. The community center was filled to bursting, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the parking lot. This wasn't a single incident. This was systematic abuse of power, and it ends now. The police department faced its own reckoning. The chief implemented immediate changes: mandatory body cameras that couldn't be turned off, civilian oversight committees with real power, and training programs led by community leaders. But more importantly, she created a culture where officers felt empowered to speak up when they saw something wrong. The young female officer who recorded the incident became a symbol of positive change. Her courage in documenting what happened inspired other officers to break their silence. More stories emerged, not just about Officer Mitchell, but about other problems that needed fixing. Mrs. Thompson's son's tech skills didn't go unnoticed either. Instead of facing trouble for accessing the police cameras, he was invited to help design a new transparency system for the department. His youth tech club started working with the Police IT team, building bridges between law enforcement and the community they served. Civil rights lawyers descended on Pine Valley, but not just to file lawsuits. They came to help draft new policies, to create guidelines that would protect both citizens and good police officers. The town became a model for other communities struggling with similar issues. The mayor established a community oversight board, giving it real teeth to investigate complaints and recommend actions. Mrs. Thompson was asked to chair it, turning her traumatic experience into a force for positive change. Other members included teachers, business owners, and retired law enforcement officers who believed in doing things right. Officer Mitchell faced criminal charges. His trial wasn't just about what he did to Mrs. Thompson. It was about years of abusing power, of targeting people based on their appearance, of thinking a badge made him above the law. When he was convicted, the sentence sent a message that echoed through police departments across the country. But the real changes happened in small, everyday ways. Police officers started attending community events, not just as security, but as participants. They joined in neighborhood cleanups, helped at food banks, and built relationships with the people they served. The us versus them mentality began to crumble. The police chief made sure every new officer heard Mrs. Thompson's story during training. Not just what happened that night, but everything that led up to it and everything that followed. "This is what happens when we forget our true purpose," she would tell them. "And this is how we make it right." Local businesses put up signs supporting both the community and good police officers. The message was clear: Pine Valley could have both safety and justice. They weren't opposing forces. They were partners in creating a better town for everyone. Mrs. Thompson's son's live stream had started a nationwide conversation. Other communities facing similar issues reached out, asking for advice, looking for guidance on how to make their own changes. Pine Valley's response became a blueprint for turning crisis into opportunity. The story could have ended with punishment, but instead, it ended with transformation. It showed that real change doesn't just come from removing bad actors. It comes from rebuilding systems, from changing cultures, and from communities coming together to demand better. 1 year later, Pine Valley had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The community center buzzed with new energy as Mrs. Thompson stood at the podium, her hair grown back into a beautiful silver crown, addressing a room full of police cadets, community members, and young people. Change doesn't come from hate, she told them, her voice carrying the wisdom of experience. It comes from people brave enough to stand up and say, "This isn't right," and then work together to fix it. The cadets in their crisp uniforms nodded, many taking notes. They weren't just learning law enforcement, they were learning humanity. Her son sat in the front row, now heading a new youth police technology partnership program. The laptop that once stringed injustice now helped bridge gaps between law enforcement and the community. Local kids learned about cybersecurity while police officers learned about the community they served. It was a partnership nobody had imagined possible a year ago. The young female officer who recorded the incident had been promoted to lead the department's new community relations unit. She worked closely with Mrs. Thompson, turning the police station from a place people feared into a community resource center. "We're here to serve" became more than just words. It was a promise kept every day. The police chief stood at the back of the room, watching with pride as her department became a national model for reform. Other cities sent their officers to learn from Pine Valley's example. The training program they developed, combining community involvement with professional policing, was being copied across the country. Mrs. Thompson's story had sparked something bigger than herself. The documentary made about the incident won awards, not for showing what went wrong, but for showing how a community could come together to make things right. Schools used it in their civics classes. Police academies made it required viewing. The tech club that helped expose the truth had grown into a full-fledged youth leadership program. They didn't just work with computers anymore. They worked on solving community problems, using technology to build bridges instead of walls. Their latest project was an app that helped police and citizens communicate better during emergencies. The Community Oversight Board became a model of cooperation. When problems arose, and they still did, they were handled with transparency and fairness. Officers who did their jobs well felt supported, while those who crossed lines faced real consequences. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Local businesses that had stood up that night continued showing support in practical ways. The diner started a program where officers and community members could share meals and conversation. The hardware store helped renovate the community center. Small gestures that built trust day by day. Mrs. Thompson's hair grew back fuller than ever, but she wore it as more than just a style. It was a reminder. Sometimes, she would tell the youth groups she still mentored, "Our hardest moments become our greatest strength." The kids understood. They had watched their community transform pain into progress. Her son received a full scholarship to study computer science, but he chose to stay local, taking classes online while continuing his work with the police department. "Real change happens at home," he explained when people asked why he didn't go to a big city school. And we're not done yet. The final scene at the community center that day wasn't an ending. It was a new beginning. As Mrs. Thompson finished her speech, the room filled with applause. But it was the sight of police officers and community members talking, laughing, and planning together that told the real story. A year after that terrible night, Pine Valley had become proof that justice wasn't just about punishing wrong. It was about building something better. The town had shown that when people stand together, when they choose dignity over division, when they work to lift each other up instead of tear each other down, real change is possible.